Every doctor at Seoul National University Hospital had stopped hoping. The most feared crime boss in all of Korea, a man who had built a brutal empire from nothing before he turned 35, was lying in a private room on the top floor, surrounded by armed guards and connected to machines that beeped out a slow, steady countdown to his death. 3 weeks after a violent ambush left Dominic Seo-Jin Kade bleeding in the street, the results were the same every morning. No real brain activity. His body was shutting down one organ at a time. And his older brother, Adrian, had already signed the papers. 72 hours. That was all the time Dominic had left. Outside those hospital walls, his empire was already being torn apart. His enemies moved fast, grabbing territory, settling old scores, acting like he was already in the ground. Every person who walked into that room did so out of fear or greed, not one of them out of love. But every night, after the hallways went quiet, a young woman named Zariah Monroe would push her cleaning cart through the door of room 1847 and do something nobody else did. She talked to him. Not because she knew who he was. Not because she wanted anything from him. But because her grandmother had always told her that even a sleeping soul could hear a kind voice. And Zariah had never stopped believing that. Zariah was barely keeping her own life together. A black single mother working double shifts at the hospital just to stay afloat. She carried the weight of a $12,000 medical debt she had no idea how to pay, a string of threatening messages from her abusive ex, Derek, and the quiet, constant fear that one bad week would take everything, including her daughter, away from her. She had every reason to keep her head down. Every reason to stay invisible. Instead, she pulled her cart up beside his bed, wrung out her mop, and talked. She told this silent stranger about her little girl, Nyla Grace. About how Nyla laughed with her whole belly. About the way she pressed her small hand flat against the window every time she saw the moon. About the worn stuffed bear they'd found at a thrift store that Nyla refused to sleep without. And somewhere deep inside the thick gray fog of his coma, the most dangerous man in Korea was holding on to her voice like it was the only solid thing left in the world, because Zariah's stories about Nyla were the only points of light keeping his mind from going dark forever. Then came the night that changed everything. The night Zariah had no babysitter, no backup plan, and a feverish toddler who wouldn't stop crying, and no choice but to slip Nyla quietly into room 1847. The night she laid her sick, exhausted little girl on the chest of a man the whole world had already given up on. What happened over the next 8 hours wasn't in any medical textbook. No doctor ordered it. No machine measured it. No science could explain it. But sometimes the thing that pulls a person back from the edge isn't a drug, or a surgery, or a miracle from above. Sometimes it's the soft weight of a sleeping child, and a heartbeat so small and steady it sounds like a whisper saying, "Stay." If this story doesn't move you, nothing will. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Because the most powerful person in the room isn't always the one holding a weapon. Sometimes it's the one holding a child. Zariah Monroe had a system. She always saved room 1847 for last. Not because it was the hardest room to clean. It wasn't. The man in the bed never moved, never made a mess, never needed anything adjusted. It was the easiest room on the whole floor, technically speaking. She saved it for last because it was the only room where she allowed herself to slow down. Every other room, she worked fast, head down, cartwheels squeaking, the sharp smell of disinfectant following her like a shadow. She had a quota to hit and a bus to catch and a little girl waiting at home with Ms. Adela next door, who only agreed to watch Nyla until 10. So Zariah moved. She always moved. But room 1847 was different. She didn't know his name at first. The nurses called him the patient in 1847, and the guards outside his door called him nothing at all, just stood there with their arms crossed and their eyes forward, like statues carved out of stone. There were always two of them. Sometimes three. Zoraya had learned not to ask questions about rooms like his. The first night she talked to him, she hadn't planned to. She'd had a terrible shift. A visitor on the third floor had knocked her entire cart sideways and walked away without a word. Her left shoe had soaked through from a mopped hallway that dried too slowly. And she'd gotten a voicemail from Derek. Just 3 seconds of silence before he hung up, which somehow felt worse than anything he could have said. So when she walked into room 1847 and looked at the man lying there, still, pale, and completely alone even with machines crowding every inch of space around him, something inside her just opened up. "You're lucky, you know," she said quietly, wringing out her mop. "You don't have to listen to anybody tonight." She laughed a little at herself, then kept talking. She told him about Nyla. How that morning her daughter had stacked 4 cereal boxes into a tower, called it a castle, and cried when it fell. How she was starting to say full sentences now, real ones, not just single words, and how every new one felt like a tiny gift Zoraya hadn't known she was waiting for. She talked until the room was clean and her cart was full and the clock above the door read 9:47. Then she paused at the doorway, looked back at him once, and said, "Good night, stranger. Same time tomorrow." She meant it as a joke. But she came back. She always came back. The letter came on a Tuesday. Zoraya found it wedged between a takeout menu and an electricity bill, its return address stamped in cold, official blue ink. She almost didn't open it. She'd learned that nothing good ever came in an envelope that looked like that. But she opened it anyway, standing right there in the hallway with her coat still on and her keys still in her hand. $25,000. She read it twice. Then a third time, like the number might change if she looked long enough. It didn't. The hospital where Nyla had been treated for pneumonia 8 months ago had been patient, the letter said. They had tried to work with her, the letter said. But the remaining balance was now overdue, and if she did not contact their billing department within 30 days, the account would be sent to collections. Zoraya folded the letter, put it in the kitchen drawer with the others. Then she sat down on the edge of her bed and did the math she already knew by heart. Rent, utilities. Nyla's daycare, the cheap one, the one with the peeling wall mural and the broken heater, the one she hated but couldn't afford to replace. Groceries. Bus fare. Ms. Adela's babysitting money, always paid in cash, always on time, because Ms. Adela was the only thing standing between Zoraya and a complete collapse. When she was done adding, she stared at what was left. $31. That was the arithmetic of her life. Every month, she ran the same numbers, and every month, they told her the same thing. There was no room for emergencies. There was no room for error. There was certainly no room for $25,000. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed. Derek. Not a call this time. A text. Short, like all his messages, he never needed many words to make her stomach drop. "I heard Nyla's been sick. You should let me know these things. I'm still her father." Zoraya stared at the screen until the words blurred. He hadn't been Nyla's father in any real sense for 2 years. He hadn't paid a single bill, hadn't shown up once. But he had a way of appearing exactly when things got hard, like he had a radar for weakness, like he could smell the moments when she had nothing left to fight with. She put the phone face down on the mattress. Then she got up, changed into her uniform, kissed a sleeping Nyla on the forehead, and went to work. She had a shift to finish. She had a room to clean. And right now, she needed to hear herself talk. Adrian Kade did not pace. He did not cry. He did not stand at his brother's bedside and beg or pray or fall apart the way people did in movies. He sat in the private waiting room on the 14th floor with his legs crossed and his jacket perfectly pressed and reviewed documents on his tablet like a man waiting for a delayed flight. That was how Adrian had always handled things. Quietly, efficiently, with both hands steady on the wheel, even when the road was falling away beneath him. The doctors had given him their final assessment that morning. 3 of them standing in a row, speaking carefully, using long words that all meant the same simple thing. Dominic was not coming back. The brain activity they were monitoring had not changed in 3 weeks. The machines were doing everything now. Everything that mattered, his brother had already left behind. Adrian had nodded, asked 2 questions, and thanked them for their time. The plug would be pulled in 48 hours. He told himself it was mercy. He almost believed it. What he did not tell the doctors, what he did not tell anyone, was that he had already taken 3 meetings that week. Quietly, carefully, with men who wanted to know what would happen to the Kade Empire once Dominic was gone. Adrian had answers ready. He always had answers ready. He was not a cruel man. He simply understood that power did not wait for grief. But someone else understood that too. Vittorio Russo had not waited at all. While Dominic lay silent in room 1847, Russo had moved through the city like smoke through a cracked door, slow, invisible, and everywhere at once. 2 of Dominic's warehouses on the east side had quietly changed hands. 3 of his longest-standing business partners had stopped returning calls. A shipment that should have arrived on Friday simply never came. Russo didn't make announcements. He didn't send warnings. He just took, piece by piece, with the calm patience of a man who had been waiting years for exactly this moment. His men called it reorganization. Everyone else called it what it was. By Thursday morning, Russo controlled nearly a third of what had once been Dominic's territory. By Friday, he was having dinner in a restaurant that had belonged to the Kade family for 11 years. He ordered the most expensive thing on the menu. He left a generous tip. And when someone at the table mentioned that Dominic still had 48 hours left, Vittorio Russo smiled into his wine glass and said nothing at all. He didn't need to. It started with a cough. A small one, just before dinner, the kind Zoraya told herself was nothing. Nyla had been coughing for 2 days, dry and shallow, easy to explain away. Teething. Dry air. The changing weather. Zoraya had a long list of reasons she kept ready for moments like this, because the alternative was a doctor's visit she couldn't afford and a fear she didn't have room to sit with. But at 11:15 that night, Nyla woke up screaming. Zoraya was out of bed before her eyes were fully open. She crossed the dark room in 4 steps, scooped her daughter up, and pressed her lips to Nyla's forehead the way her own mother had always done, the oldest thermometer in the world. She was burning. Zoraya's hands moved fast after that. She found the baby thermometer in the bathroom drawer, held it under Nyla's arm while her daughter twisted and cried, and watched the numbers climb. 103.4. She took it again. Same number, sitting there on the little screen like a warning light she couldn't switch off. She called Ms. Adela first. No answer. She called twice more. Nothing. She called the one other neighbor she trusted. Voicemail. She sat on the edge of the bed with Nyla pressed against her chest, rocking slowly, thinking through every option she had. There weren't many. There was no one to call, no one to come, no backup plan hiding somewhere she hadn't looked yet. She had to be at the hospital in 40 minutes or she would lose the shift, and losing the shift meant losing the week, and losing the week meant the electricity bill she'd already pushed as far as it could go. She couldn't call in. She simply couldn't. So she made the only decision left. She dressed Nyla in her warmest pajamas, wrapped her in the yellow blanket she never slept without, tucked the worn stuffed bear under her arm, and held her close the whole bus ride in. Nyla whimpered against her shoulder, too tired to cry properly now, her small body radiating heat like a little furnace. At the hospital, Zoraya took the back stairwell. She knew which cameras pointed where. She knew which hallways stayed empty after midnight. She had cleaned this building for 2 years, and she knew every quiet corner of it. Room 1847 was the last room anyone checked at this hour. She slipped inside, eased the door shut behind her, and stood in the blue dark quiet with her sick daughter in her arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered, to the room, to the man in the bed, to herself. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Zoraya tried everything she could think of. She walked slow circles around the room, swaying side to side with Nyla against her chest. She hummed the song her mother used to hum, low and tuneless, more feeling than melody. She tried sitting in the corner chair with Nyla bundled in the yellow blanket, rubbing small circles on her back until her own arm ached. Nothing worked. Nyla kept fussing, restless and hot, turning her face against Zoraya's neck like she was searching for something she couldn't find. Zoraya looked at the man in the bed. She didn't know why she did it. She couldn't explain it then and wouldn't be able to explain it later. It wasn't a logical thought. It was something quieter than that. Something closer to instinct or exhaustion, or maybe just the particular desperation of a mother who had run out of options at 1 in the morning. She stepped closer to the bed. The machines beeped their slow, steady rhythm. His chest rose and fell with the soft mechanical patience of the ventilator. He was warm. She had noticed that before, in the small ways a person notices things they don't mean to. The room always felt different near him. Steadier, somehow. Carefully, gently, she leaned forward and rested Nyla against his chest. She kept her hands close. She was ready to pull her back at the first sign of anything. But Nyla, who had been squirming and miserable for the last 2 hours, went still almost immediately. The beeping of the machines was slow and even. His chest moved in a calm, unbroken rhythm beneath her. And Nyla, her small ear pressed flat against him, seemed to find in that rhythm something she had been missing. Something solid, something constant, something that said here, rest here. Within 4 minutes, she was asleep. Zoraya stood with her hands hovering uselessly in the air and watched it happen. The tight little crease between Nyla's brows smoothed away. Her fingers uncurled. Her breathing slowed to match his, 2 heartbeats finding the same quiet pace in the dark. She looked so small against him. So impossibly small. And deep inside the gray fog, that vast, heavy, directionless nothing that had swallowed Dominic Seo-Jin Kade whole, something changed. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It wasn't a light. It was a feeling. Faint and warm, like the first breath of summer through a window that's been shut all winter. Like butterfly wings pressing once, twice, gently against the inside of a locked door. He didn't know what it was. He only knew he moved toward it. The first thing Dominic felt was weight. Small and warm and real, pressing gently against his chest like something that belonged there. His mind reached toward it slowly, the way a hand reaches through dark water, uncertain, searching, not yet sure what it will find. The second thing he felt was pain. It came in from every direction at once, dull and deep and total. His chest, his head, the back of his neck. His body was sending him a long, detailed report of everything it had been through, and none of it was good. He would have preferred to go back to the nothing. The nothing had been easier, but the weight on his chest held him there. He could hear breathing. Tiny, steady breathing, so soft it was almost part of the silence. And beneath that, a heartbeat that was not his own, small and quick and absolutely certain of itself, tapping away like it had somewhere important to be. His eyelids were heavy. Opening them took more effort than anything he could remember. But he did it, slowly, in pieces, the blurred white ceiling of a hospital room assembling itself above him like a photograph developing in real time. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked down. There was a child sleeping on his chest. He didn't move. He barely breathed. He just looked at her, at the dark wisps of hair against her forehead, at the small fist curled loosely near her chin, at the way she slept with the complete and total trust of someone who had never once considered that the ground might give way beneath her. He had no idea who she was. He didn't move a single muscle to disturb her. The door swung open. A night nurse stepped inside with a clipboard and a flashlight, running her routine check, and stopped dead in the doorway when she saw his eyes open. The clipboard hit the floor. She gasped, loud and sharp, and took one fast step forward with her hands outstretched toward the child. Dominic moved. It shouldn't have been possible. 3 weeks of nothing, of machines breathing for him and doctors measuring his absence in careful clinical terms, and yet his arm came up slow and deliberate, settling across the little girl's back like a barrier. Not a threat. Not aggression. A shield. His eyes met the nurse's. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a sound at all, cracked and dry and thin as paper. "Don't," he said. "You'll wake her." The nurse stood frozen in the doorway. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the machines in room 1847 began to change their tune. Rafe D'Amico did not ask questions out loud if he could help it. Questions made noise. Noise drew attention. And in his line of work, attention was the most dangerous thing a person could invite. So he sat in a plain gray car outside a plain gray building, and he watched, and he listened, and he let the facts come to him the way water found its level, quietly and without being forced. Dominic had been awake for 6 days. He hadn't asked for Adrian. Hadn't asked for his lawyers or his lieutenants or any of the people who had been circling that hospital room like they were waiting for a reading of the will. The first call he made, the very first, was to Rafe. The instructions had been simple. Find out who she is. Find out everything. And make sure she's safe. Rafe had started the same way he always started. Public records, employment files, the digital trail that every ordinary person left without knowing it. Zariah Amara Monroe, 28 years old. Single mother. 2 years at the hospital on a night cleaning rotation. Before that, waitressing. Before that, a brief enrollment at a community college that had ended without a degree and without much explanation. Clean. Completely, almost unusually clean. No criminal record. No suspicious accounts. No connections to any name Rafe recognized from the underworld on either side of any border. Just a woman who worked too many hours for too little money and paid her bills as best she could and raised her daughter in a 2-room apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator. But clean didn't mean safe. Derek Holloway had a record that was anything but. 2 arrests. 1 conviction, reduced on a technicality that made Rafe's jaw tighten when he read it. 3 separate restraining orders filed by 2 different women, Zariah's name on the most recent one, dated 18 months ago and already expired. He was currently employed, currently quiet, and currently sending Zariah messages that walked right up to the edge of a threat without technically crossing it. Rafe photographed every one of them. Then there was the debt. $25,000 sitting on her credit file like a stone around her neck, growing heavier every month with interest she had no way of outrunning. Rafe compiled everything into a single document. Neat, thorough, organized by priority. At the top of the first page, he wrote 2 names. Derek Holloway. Vittorio Russo. Then he picked up his phone and called Dominic. "You're not going to like it," he said, when the line connected. A short silence. "Tell me anyway." Zariah noticed the first thing on a Wednesday. She had logged into the hospital billing portal the same way she did every few weeks, not because anything ever changed, but because ignoring it felt worse than looking at it. The number had lived in her head for so long it had become a kind of background noise, a low hum of dread she'd learned to function around. She stared at the screen for a long time. 0. A 0 where the balance had been. A small note below it marked account settled in full with a date from 2 days ago and a reference number that meant nothing to her. She refreshed the page. Still zero. She cleared her browser and tried again. Still zero. She sat with her phone in both hands, her heart doing something strange and unsteady in her chest, and tried to find the logical explanation. A billing error, a glitch, something that would be reversed by Friday with an apologetic automated message. Nothing was reversed. She called the billing department the next morning. A polite woman checked the account twice, confirmed it was paid, and when Zariah pressed her, paid by whom, the woman simply said the payment had come through a private financial office and that the account was closed. Zariah hung up and stood in her kitchen for a full minute without moving. Then, 3 days later, Derek went quiet. Not the usual quiet, not the stretched silence between messages that always ended with another text crawling under her skin. This was different. Complete. His number stopped appearing on her phone entirely. The message threads that she'd learned to check the way other people checked the weather simply sat there, still and untouched, growing older by the day. She didn't trust it at first. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the silence to break the way his silences always eventually broke. Suddenly and badly. But a week passed. Then 2. Nothing. A woman from Nyla's daycare mentioned casually that she'd seen Derek loading boxes into a car outside his apartment building. Someone else said he'd taken a job out of state. Zariah didn't ask follow-up questions. She didn't know who was responsible. She had no proof, no explanation, no name to attach to any of it. Just a paid debt and an absence where a threat used to be, arriving together, quietly, like something slipped under a door in the night. She told herself it was coincidence. But that night, when she walked into room 1847 and looked at the man who was no longer motionless in that bed, who was awake now, watching her with dark, steady eyes, she felt something shift in the air between them. She just didn't have the words for it yet. It was Nyla who found it. Zariah had left her phone on the coffee table while she was making dinner, and Nyla, newly obsessed with swiping at screens and pressing buttons she wasn't supposed to press, had somehow opened a news app and turned the volume all the way up. Zariah came out of the kitchen with a dish towel in her hand, ready to redirect her daughter toward something less destructive, and stopped. The television would have been easy to dismiss. A headline on someone else's phone would have been easy to scroll past. But the photo on her own screen, large and unavoidable, was not easy to dismiss at all. It was him. Not pale and still against a hospital pillow. Not bruised and silent with tubes running across his face. This version of him was upright and sharply dressed, photographed outside a building she didn't recognize, his expression cold and composed in the way of a man who had never once been caught off guard. The headline beneath the photo used words she had to read twice. Dominic Seo-Jin Kade, Kade's syndicate leader, reported in stable condition following 3-week coma. Sources confirm underworld power struggle intensifies as notorious crime boss resurfaces. Zariah sat down on the couch slowly, the dish towel still in her hand. She read the article once. Then she followed the links, the older articles, the archived ones, the ones with more photos and longer headlines and words like cartel and empire and suspected in connection with and no charges filed. She read about territory wars and disappeared witnesses and a criminal organization that stretched across 3 countries and had been built, according to one investigative piece, on a foundation of violence so deliberate and complete that entire neighborhoods had learned to look the other way. Nyla climbed into her lap. Zariah held her without feeling it. She thought about every night she had walked into that room. Every story she had told. Every fear she had said out loud in the dark because she'd believed, truly believed, that she was just talking to a sleeping stranger who couldn't hear her anyway. She had told him about Nyla's laugh. About the stuffed bear. About the $25,000 she didn't know how to pay. She had laid her sick daughter on his chest. She pressed her hand flat over her mouth. Outside the window, the city moved the way it always moved, loud and indifferent and completely unaware. And Zariah sat very still in the middle of it, holding her daughter, trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the name she had just read. They didn't fit together. Not even close. Zariah had decided she was done. She wasn't going back to room 1847. She wasn't going to think about Dominic Seo-Jin Kade or his empire or the debt that had vanished or the silence where Derek used to be. She was going to request a transfer to a different floor, keep her head down, and go back to being invisible the way she had always been invisible, safe inside the smallness of her own life. She had almost convinced herself it was that simple. Then she walked into Nyla's bedroom on a Thursday morning and saw the rose. It was laying on the pillow beside her daughter's head. Red, fully bloomed, with the thorns carefully removed and the stem wrapped in a small strip of white ribbon. Nyla was still asleep, one arm around her stuffed bear, completely unaware of the thing resting inches from her face. Zariah didn't scream. She grabbed Nyla first, pulled her up and against her chest and backed out of the room in one fast, silent motion. Then she stood in the hallway with her daughter in her arms and looked at her front door. It was locked. The deadbolt was in place. The chain was on. It didn't matter. Someone had been inside anyway. Her hands were shaking by the time she found her phone. She didn't stop to ask herself why she called the number she called. She didn't stop to think about articles or archives or words like syndicate and notorious. She just called the one person who had already proven, without explanation or apology, that he could make a threat disappear. Dominic answered on the second ring. She didn't say hello. She just said, "Someone was in my apartment. They left something in Nyla's room. I don't know how they got in and I don't know what it means, but don't touch it." His voice was quiet and immediate. "Don't move anything. What does it look like?" "A rose." One red rose on her pillow. A beat of silence that felt very long. "Pack a bag," he said. "One bag, enough for a week. You have 20 minutes. I can't just..." "Zariah." The way he said her name stopped her. Not hard, not commanding, just certain, the way a wall is certain, the way a locked door is certain. "Pack the bag." She packed the bag. A black car was waiting outside her building before she reached the lobby. A man she didn't recognize held the door open without a word. Nyla clutched her bear and looked around with wide, curious eyes, unbothered, trusting her mother completely. Zariah got in, and the city fell away behind her. Vittorio Russo had always believed that patience was power. He had waited years for Dominic Kade to fall. He had moved carefully, taken territory quietly, and never once overplayed his hand. He was, by his own estimation, a man of discipline and foresight. Which was why the meeting request confused him. It came through the proper channels, respectful, formal, the kind of message that couldn't be ignored without sending its own message back. Dominic Kade, barely 3 weeks out of a hospital bed, wanted to talk. No weapons. Neutral ground. Just two men and the space between them. Russo came because refusing would have looked like fear. He left the meeting 2 hours later a quieter man than he had arrived. Nobody who was present that night ever repeated what was said. But within a week, the warehouses changed hands again. The business partners returned their calls. And Vittorio Russo, who had dined so comfortably in a Kade family restaurant not long ago, suddenly developed an interest in opportunities that existed very far from the city. He relocated by the end of the month. Dominic didn't celebrate. He sat in the study of his home with Rafe across from him and a city's worth of problems spread across the table between them, and he worked. He always worked, that part hadn't changed. But something in the direction of it had shifted, quietly, like a river that finds a new channel after a long rain. He kept thinking about what Rafe had shown him. Not just Zoraya's file, but the others, names and numbers that told the same basic story in different variations. Women working overnight shifts in hospitals and hotels and office buildings across the city, raising children alone, carrying debt that compounded faster than any honest wage could chase it. Doing everything right and still ending up with nothing to spare. He knew something about building things from nothing. He had just never built anything that didn't eventually require a weapon to protect it. He picked up a pen and wrote 2 words at the top of a blank page. Grace Foundation. It took him a moment to realize why he'd chosen that name. Then he thought of Nyla, asleep on his chest in a dark hospital room, her breath steady and warm and completely without fear. Nyla Grace. He left the name exactly as it was. The Foundation's first program was simple: emergency childcare funding for night shift workers, no application longer than 1 page, no waiting period longer than 48 hours. The kind of help that arrived before the crisis did. The kind of help that might have changed everything, for a woman pushing a cart down a quiet hallway, saving the last room for last. The Grace Foundation opened on a Tuesday. Not with a grand ceremony or a ribbon cutting or the kind of event that required a guest list and a photographer. Just a building, clean and warm and freshly painted, with its doors unlocked for the first time and a small group of people standing inside it, looking at what had been made. Zoraya had not expected the mural. It covered the entire back wall of the main room, floor to ceiling, painted by a local artist Dominic had quietly commissioned 3 weeks before. A deep night sky, deep blue shading into purple at the edges, scattered with stars that seemed to have been placed individually, each one deliberate. And in the center, enormous and luminous and impossible to look away from, a full moon. She stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Nyla had no such hesitation. She walked straight up to the wall, pressed her palm flat against the painted surface, and looked back at her mother with an expression of complete satisfaction, like she had just laid claim to something important. Zoraya laughed, the kind that came from somewhere unexpected and arrived before she could stop it. Dominic appeared beside her quietly, the way he always moved, like a man who had spent a lifetime making sure he was never heard coming. He was looking at the mural, not at her. But she was aware of him the way she had always been aware of him, even in the early days when she hadn't had a name to put to the feeling. She likes it, he said. She likes anything she's allowed to touch, Zoraya said. The pause. The easy kind. There's paint, he said. If you want. She turned to look at him. He nodded toward a small table near the wall where an artist's assistant had set out shallow trays of color, clearly prepared in advance, clearly intentional. Nyla was already moving toward them. They did it together. Nyla first, pressing her small hand into the yellow paint with focused seriousness and then slapping it against the wall just below the moon, leaving a tiny sunburst of a print. Then Zoraya, beside it, her hand brown against the deep blue. Then Dominic, his large and careful and placed exactly between theirs, like something finally landing where it was meant to be. 3 prints on a midnight wall. Nyla studied them with her head tilted and then nodded, satisfied, the way children nod when the world has arranged itself correctly. Zoraya looked at the wall. Then at the man standing beside her. Then at her daughter, who was already reaching for more paint. She didn't have a word for what they were yet. But standing there, in a room built from second chances, beneath a sky that had been painted in the dark so others could find their way, she thought that maybe the word would come. And that maybe, for now, it was enough just to stay.